All right. So today we're going to be going over Cuckphilosophy's debate with the Distributist, both on Marxism and postmodernism, as well as little talks about inequality versus equality and whatnot. So just quickly set this up, Cuckphilosophy is a YouTuber that does a lot of videos on postmodernism, explaining really difficult concepts. You know, he runs through like some of the big names like Baudrillard and Marx, and he does lots of interesting videos. Like he has a video on human rights that sort of kind of combines a bunch of different ideas. So he does a lot of interesting work. And then we have the Distributist, who is a self-proclaimed right-wing reactionary activist. So this debate was pretty interesting, just because I thought Cuck didn't seem very comfortable in the debate format. So I thought it'd be fun to bring on some friends and we could discuss it all and give our thoughts on it. So, like I said earlier, if you guys want to me to pause, just say something on the mic and I can pause the video. I'm going to set this to a little higher speed than normal, so doesn't take forever. Anyway, let's get this started.
So good evening, viewers. I'm here today with Cuckphilosophy, or the YouTuber behind Cuckphilosophy, and we're going to be talking about a variety of things. Mostly, I think we're going to be talking about progressivism, Marxism, inequality. Cuckphilosophy is a YouTube channel that I recommend to everyone who watches my channel. Comes from more of a leftist persuasion, as opposed to this channel, which is certainly more right-wing.
I'm going to skip this because it's just kind of intro. Let's see.
It's technical academics, not philosophy. By continental, we mean stuff like Hegel and Schopenhauer and that sort of stuff.
Yeah, basically, it's like more philosophy that comes from France and Germany, and it's contrasted with more like Anglo-Saxon philosophy, which is more sees itself as like an accessory to science and sees its main goal as basically the analysis of language and making words more clear and rigorous, whereas continental philosophy is more things like anything from existentialism to phenomenology to Marxism to postmodernism, things like that.
I just got to say, that is such a continental take on what analytic philosophy is. And it's just some sort of accessory to science. And they want to make stuff clear with language. Yeah.
I feel like they do like making stuff clear with language. I don't know if they would see themselves as an accessory to science.
Really, I feel like we have a lot of examples in analytic philosophy that are cutting against that. You know, like, I mean, some of the biggest names, Quine and Wittgenstein, are going to be like two primary examples of people who don't think it's possible. I mean, Kuhn technically is an analytic philosopher too, and he does a lot of work when it comes to sort of like incommensurability with respect to language. So I think I don't know. I mean, Cook's not an expert in analytic philosophy, so I'm not gonna nail him here, but yeah, I feel like it's a super continental take on analytic phil.
How do you think they would see themselves, I guess, then?
Well, it's kind of like asking a continental philosopher, like, what does continental philosophy do? You know, it's not like there's one like overarching branch that all this kind of falls under. So there's lots of analytic philosophers who are doing work that is either like kind of bridging the gap with continental theory or is pushing against different movements that are currently occurring. So I feel like it's too broad, really, to kind of catch under any umbrella.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. When you define the analytics, he gave them like actual philosophical commitments, you know, or like to a certain extent. But he defined the continentals more discursively, like naming continental discourses. I think that would like be more appropriate, maybe. pointing to, because we're gonna see what we think all of the other camp, has in common as sticking out clearly, and we're gonna see more diversity on our other side, or on our own side. Excuse me. I think you're right there.
Yeah. All right. Let's keep.
So you're focused on post. Well, actually, perhaps before we go on, so you're sort of a newcomer to the YouTube scene. What inspired you to start making videos intent on exploring?
For a long time,
Who likes American folk music? I think you hit the nail on the head with a lot of your critiques of it, but I'm not going to steal your win there.
Thank you.
Everyone who's watching it should go watch that one. That's good. But anyway, go ahead. So you're interested in just like basically taking cultural elements and analyzing them.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm gonna skip through this part too. Hopefully this is good.
In voice from Kermit the Frog.
Mm-hmm.
But in particular, I've noticed that what you particularly take issue with is Jordan Peterson's characterization of postmodernism.
Yeah, that and Marxism.
Mm-hmm.
It's just that he's very popular, but for people who are well versed in either postmodern philosophy or Marxist philosophy, it is very clear that he's not very well versed in those topics, but he talks about them nonetheless, and a lot of people basically take his word for it, and I just thought it's important to sort of give another perspective.
So if you mind, what do you think are some of the things that Jordan Peterson is getting wrong about Marxism and postmodernism?
Well, there's a lot. I don't know. Which one should I begin with? I guess Marxism?
Well, you might be surprised, but I'll get into this a little bit later when we start segueing on to comparing our beliefs. But
yeah,
I'm an anti-Marxist. I'm a reactionary. Yeah. I have to be. I'm quite vehemently anti-Marx, and I organize against Marxist ideas because I think they're.
All right, quick question: do you have to be a reactionary? Do you have to be against Marxism?
Yeah, I'm glad you paused that there, because like I love how that's just taken completely for granted and dogmatically even. Like, I am reactionary, therefore anti-Marxist, and there is no gap between them. I don't know. I don't think you have to be. I can imagine a reactionary Marxism. I think that would look something like, well, maybe not properly reactionary or properly Marxist, but I can definitely think of a reactionary that was not anti-Marxist, that drew upon class analysis. And I think to a certain extent, the best practitioners of class warfare are always the reactionaries in the capitalist class to a certain extent, right? But yeah, I don't know. What do you guys think? I'm not convinced that you have to be anti-Marxist to be a reactionary.
Yeah, so I'm pretty skeptical too, because I feel like you could sort of like if we take historical materialism, and sort of like, well, I don't know, we could attempt to like sort of like rework it such that like instead of moving forward in a progressive manner, we're reaching like communism as the final stage, right? You like are working towards like sort of a development away from communism and towards like some like hybrid, I don't know, either feudalism or like slave-based society or like ancient communal society. Like I feel like you could because the kind of reactionary that the distributist isn't going to be like, hey, I want us to go back just straight to feudalism or something, right? He's going to try to argue that he wants to go back to like when the sort of like last ideas that we had were working, and then like build off them. So like there is like a sort of like progressiveness that's like already inherent to his style of reactionary politics. So I feel like it's possible, but
anti-human. I am much more
Mhm.
friendly to postmodernism, and I might explain that because I anticipate the answers you're going to give me. But perhaps we could start with your characterization of Marxism and then your characterization of postmodernism, because I think, obviously one precedes the other, right?
Mhm. So should I basically just mention some of the ways in which Jordan Peterson misrepresents it?
Well, I mean, I guess when you say Marxism, we're talking about just dialectic materialism, the view
Yeah.
of the history. I mean, I guess, what's your nutshell version of what you think the important elements of Marxism are, and then point out how that contrasts, I guess, maybe Jordan Peterson's. I mean, I'm not expecting you to do some intellectual feat here, but just roughly, right?
Yeah. So, well, obviously there are different strands of Marxism, but usually the main elements are dialectical materialism and historical materialism. So it's a very specific view of history. It's also it's a way of analyzing events by reference to the material conditions of society. So things like
Mhm.
the mode of production, and it's also another essential element is class struggle. Which is the driving force of history.
The driving force of history.
Yeah.
That's what I most characterize about Marx, is its formation of human events into a history that is claimed to be scientific.
Yeah.
Quick note. One important thing that he missed was labor theory of value. I feel like if you're a traditional Marxist, that's something you're going to have to kind of subscribe to. And it's super, super fundamental to his later work. So yeah, that's my opinion.
I feel like maybe also it's hard to talk about Marxism as such without distinguishing, I think, between Marxism as a political practice and Marxism as a set of philosophical theoretical commitments, because these overlap, in a lot of ways. But I imagine what Jordan Peterson means by Marxism is actually closer to Marxism as a political practice necessarily, than a set of theoretical positions, and that might be why he showed up to the debate only having read the pamphlet that existed as a piece of political propaganda.
Yeah, it seems weird to label yourself explicitly anti-Marxist because, like Bettina said, you could distinguish two different versions of Marx. You could say, I agree with his philosophical criticisms of capitalism, but I still think that capitalism is the best system, even with these criticisms in mind. And then you could be a Marxist who believes in the project of communism. So it seems weird to me to label yourself anti-Marxist, because does that mean you disagree with all of Marx's political writings on capitalism?
Yeah, that's also a good point. And then one other thing I was just thinking was that I think there's also different kinds of Marxism with respect to the areas that people are interested in. So Cuck doesn't know very much, I think, about sort of the economic side of Marx, and he later in the debate he'll kind of back off if he's pressed on any of those questions. Instead, he's more invested in sort of the philosophical commitments that Marx is making, or the sort of I don't know, philosophic questions that Marx is trying to provide answers towards. So that's also another important thing.
I guess one thing in terms of class struggle that I could mention that Jordan Peterson, it's not always wrong, but it is a bit inaccurate. Basically, Jordan Peterson characterizes Marxism as being a conflict between the rich and the poor,
Mm-hmm.
which, by the way, people who see a conflict between the rich and the poor predates Marx.
Of course. I mean, you go
several
back
hundred
to
years.
Machiavelli, right?
Yeah. But the thing about Marx is he didn't view it in terms of how much wealth you have, so rich and poor, but what is your position in relation to the means of production.
Mm-hmm.
So you could technically imagine a proletarian person who, say, won the lottery and is now rich, but nonetheless, unless he invests in capital, he will remain proletarian. So it's not so much the amount of wealth you have, but the relations you have with the means of production, which determines your class interests.
Oh, I certainly think that's true. But just to give the devil his due, I'm not really a big Peterson fan. But isn't that kind of like correlated, right? I mean, it's kind of like there's some examples where it's not the same thing. But like all things being equal, like wealth tends to get invested.
Yeah. So
unless you're like a lottery winner and you blow your cash, or you just plowed into a political movement, like you will, like if you win the Mega Millions and become a billionaire, you'd have to be pretty stupid not to own property in 10 years, right?
Yeah. But well, that's the thing. Like the rich versus poor, it's kind of like a generally sort of working definition, but it's not something that's essential or unique to Marx. So I think that's kind of a mistaken characterization, because like Plato saw a conflict between the rich and the poor, but obviously that didn't make him a Marxist.
I think the other important thing to see here is that I don't know if Marx strictly saw things in terms of like this really rigid binary between like the proletariat and the capitalist class. That's it was one thing with Marxism is that it's sort of the way Marx is analyzing certain phenomena is going to be dependent on the sort of vantage point that he wants to adopt for that particular like explanation. So in like other works other than Capital, Marx is going to be pointing out that there's like different classes that go into it, like the lumpen proletariat and whatnot. So it's not the most accurate definition.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I do think it's important to clarify like that, because even when what is our distributivist's name here, so I don't have to keep calling him that because it's hard to say.
I don't know. We can just call him Big D.
All right. Even when Big D, responds to what I think is a good point, that whether we agree with the rigid binary of prole versus bouge, the importance of class being defined in social relations rather than actual property, I think is essentially Marxist in some sense. But even when Big D responds, he's framing things in terms of like, from an individual's perspective, like an individual would be stupid not to invest wealth. And I think like one of Marx's strengths is to look at capital itself as like a process, and not as that solid kind of property that is just owned. It's this process whereby wealth begets more wealth, right? And so when we think of capital in those terms, like it's not just enough to win the lottery and get a nice lump sum. You also have to be socially positioned in such a way to be able to translate that into real capital and to make that money beget other money, and to actually jump across, like if we're going to talk about a prole versus bouge divide, that's going to be depend upon how you were positioned as a prole beforehand. I think that is an interesting point to bring up there. But no, I agree that because even like the lumpen proletariat and the industrial reserve army, I think is a really interesting component of the proletariat that is not the same as the rest of the proletariat that has to like actually work. Has a distinct class position in a lot of ways from the part of the proletariat that exists just to scare the part that is working, with unemployment and whatnot, and to be surplus labor.
Yeah. So to hop off what you're saying, I would say first off, I feel like what we should be able to say is that if a person were to win the lottery, they would clearly be better off than most of the proletariat, if not all. But Marx would still say this person's alienated, which I think he would say about the bourgeoisie also.
Yeah.
The capitalists, So I would say like, yeah, basically like this person is better off, but they're still like fundamentally alienated in some sense. And I think that like this criticism, like I think a much more interesting criticism is just like how should you apply what Marx is saying here to like a modern society, right? Where, like, I was just reading about Slavoj Žižek's like a book on the Communist Manifesto, and he was saying like, you know, according to Marx's definition, the proletariat is supposed to be like the majority, and he had this vision of the proletariat being, you know, essentially people who worked in factories. I think now it's become less clear as to who constitutes the proletariat. Like, what does a teacher have in common with like a software engineer in San Francisco, et cetera, et cetera. So I think Zizek's point of like not getting rid of it, just thinking about it, is a more interesting criticism than just like being like, you know, well, is the person who wins the lottery still alienated in a Marxist sense? And, you know, I don't know.
Yeah, I'm following that. I think that's also, yeah, I think like more interesting criticisms are going to be along the lines of like, how do we situate service, like a service economy within sort of like classical Marxist definitions? Because Marx, you know, kind of famously didn't really talk much about, he was focused on commodity production, and you know, in America and most first world Western countries, they're going to have an emphasis on service economies. And so that seems like a pretty interesting place that you could sort of critique the divide, because like, what's the means of production when we're talking about like a teacher? You know, if I get all my textbooks from the internet, then I do have some of the some control over some of the means of production. Obviously, I don't have the building or the electricity or whatnot, but now that it's moved online and I'm teaching online, like I have more control over the means of production now, because I'm sort of in charge of Zoom. Although there's interesting questions about, you know, now like Zoom is itself a means of production and it's owned by some company, blah blah blah. But still,
I completely agree with that, and I think you're getting at something really interesting, which is like, you know, exactly like what is a software engineer or a teacher's like relationship to the means of production in like a really like contemporary setting. But I still think like you can take this into account and still think like, well, we are still alienated by money in some sense. So
yeah,
you know, it's like what? So you have to call yourself an anti-Marxist because you found like some criticisms of Marx. Like, I still think that Marx is making great points.
yeah, exactly. I think we got to be open to development here.
Well, I mean, and I'm someone who's very sympathetic to class conflicts. If we describe class conflicts in their pre-enlightenment, I think you see class conflicts being described by, like you said, Plato. You see them described by Machiavelli.
Mm-hmm.
My problem comes with the Enlightenment and the French Revolution, and
Right.
therefore, I mean, this is perhaps getting to my critique of postmodernism. We see these ideas, which I consider to be total misunderstandings, of like liberty, freedom, and inequality, and these sort of kind of, they get superimposed on political struggles. And I agree with, well, I'm not going to sort of steal, you know, your explanation of your own video. And I understand perhaps, you know, Marx wasn't all about egalitarianism, but I feel like the things that come out of the Enlightenment that make descriptions of class struggle after the Enlightenment more difficult to talk about is, we get these ideas of equality and liberty that are, and fraternity, which are misunderstood and opposed to each other. And we have mythologized religious versions of those things. And then we also take into this idea, my main critique of Marx, which is this idea that it's scientific somehow. And you know, I mean, like, is Marxism somehow more scientific than you know, Theolyticles' version of history? I don't really think so. And so, you know, all of a sudden we build these things into these systems, and I don't know if they really can, you know, they really can bear the weight that's put on them, to be quite honest.
So, okay, I think there's two things I want to respond to there. So first of all, the sort of liberty, fraternity, equality trio, that's more something that appears in the liberal tradition, whereas that's not something that Marx so much talks about. And in fact, this is another like common misunderstanding about Marx, is that his critique is not, at least not explicitly, a moral one. the way that he talks about communism is not as an application of some abstract moral principle like equality or liberty. Rather, he basically he analyzes the current state of affairs and the current economic situation and tries to extrapolate from that how history will move on further. So it's not an application of an abstract moral principle. And in fact, he was very critical of what he called utopian socialists for their moralizing.
I agree with you that is how Marx conceptualized himself.
Yeah.
The difficulty is that it's like Freud, right? There's some kind of like a lot of the fans try to have it both ways too.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Freud is a very evocative writer, in some ways he would be a great literary critic, but he was projecting himself as a psychologist, and his psychology's bunk. And the same thing is true for Marx.
Oof, the psychology is bunk, boys. We're done. Pack it up. No more psychoanalysis anymore.
I think Big D took an L here when, like, this is a terrible critique of Marxism, and I think Cuck dunks on him right here, because like all of what you just said is the liberal tradition. It is not like he's probably going to go into something about how, like, how can you read Capital if not morally, or blah 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 blah. But he's definitely not asking you to do so. It's one of those like hypothetical imperatives, if there's an imperative here at all. Like, if you would like freedom and the free association of labor and democracy, like you say you do, then you will overthrow capital and abolish the proletariat will abolish itself. It's not capitalists are bad people. I think that is an important distinction. But I do want to ask both of you, are we committed to the scientific status of Marxism? Because that, like, I like, if I was in a serious debate about that, I would just have to say, I don't know what science means, and until you explain it to me, I can't answer your question. But I'm not particularly worried about its scientific status. The Freud thing is really interesting because, like, Boy was a whole neuroscientist and, like, did groundbreaking work on the neuron. So if he wasn't a scientist in the 19th century, like, I don't know who was. Most of his work that we read today is not scientific, but he doesn't mean it to be. It's philosophy informed scientifically by his case studies and work in the clinic and whatnot. But I'm not necessarily committed to the scientific status of Marxism, and I don't necessarily see that as a big loss if we have to surrender. But I was wondering what you guys think.
Yeah, so he's gonna kind of get into his, like, theory of what science is a little bit later. I can give a little spoiler now. He's gonna say that it's based on, like, the predictive capacity that the sort of theory offers, and it's a pretty weak ass definition of science. It's like sort of like I don't know, like a smooth brained 8th grader take on, like, I read a textbook one time and this is what they said science was. It's like just such an immature understanding of what science is doing, because, like, you obviously have zero like sort of historical knowledge of the development of science proper, right? Lots of science is going to be built on retrodiction. I have, like, a whole spiel on this because it's just so naive to be, like, trying to argue this angle. And so I do agree with you, Bettina, that's probably the route I would take too, is like, what's your definition of science? And then you could, probably go from there. But ultimately, usually what I do with my students is I'm going to point out there's, like, quite a few routes you can go when someone's arguing from this, like, quote unquote science angle. And then so you could, like, say, like, hey, Marxism is a science, or hey, psychoanalysis is a science, and sort of, like, argue for the theoretical virtues, and compare them against the theoretical virtues that, like, psychology or mainstream neoclassical economics offers. Or what you could do is just kind of destabilize, like, how far science as a concept reaches, and just kind of say, like, hey, this scientific inquiry is kind of cordoned off to this area of empirical experience, but it doesn't cover anything that's generally considered philosophy, or it doesn't cover religious experience or whatnot. So
yeah, and it doesn't cover most of the sorry Kieran, but it doesn't cover most of like the most important decisions we make every day about how to live and how to relate.
Yeah. So I have a point, but like, correct me if I'm wrong here, but he's essentially saying like, I like because I agree with Bettina in what he was saying before of like, basically, I do think Cuck kind of nailed him here, in some sense. So my interpretation is that he's basically got him to admit, because before he said I'm an anti-Marxist, and now he just said, yeah, I do like some Marx, because Cuck points out, well, this whole, because Big D basically says I don't know, it seems like he's counter Enlightenment in some way, because he just said,
yeah, he is.
yeah, there you go. So he basically doesn't like this idea that like Marx is associated with the Enlightenment, or that I guess he'd be associated with like Enlightenment philosophers. So then Cuck basically says that's not true. So then it forces Big D to kind of backtrack and say like, okay, well, then I like some Marx. So then it feels like he's doing something where he's like, okay, well, I like some Marx, but I don't like everything he's associated with. Like, is this a correct interpretation?
Yeah, that's a great catch. Because now he's kind of now he's gonna what he tries to go after like this whole idea of like the Marxism fans and say, oh well, they interpret it badly. But that's also like a pretty like smooth-brained 8th grader take as well, because then you don't get anywhere, because it's we ostensibly have like we can present a symmetrical argument against like reactionaries and talk about like Nazism and how they're reactionaries and whatnot, and so it doesn't seem like any position is going to be subject to that sort of critique anyway.
Well, I'm also wondering how because he says like how can you both be sympathetic to class struggle and then describe yourself as anti-Marxist, right? But then also, how can you be all Mr. Anti-Enlightenment, Mr. Dark Enlightenment fellow over here, but then be like, I reject Marxism because of its pretension to scientific status. Like, don't you need Enlightenment values to, or maybe I'm not, and he's got a more nuanced point here, but like, why is science a important territory for you to defend at all, and why do you have any stake in it if you are anti-Enlightenment?
Yeah, sorry, go for it, Karen.
That's a really good point. The one thing I would say, and then I think John, you should go off what like what Bettina and I are saying, which is like I feel like part of what I'm trying to do here is I want to try to catch him, because I feel like there's only two routes you can really go with this. You can say that because like G.A. Cohen, I forget in which book, makes this point very clearly, because J. Cohen really believes in this idea that calling it Marxism is a bad thing, and it should have been called scientific socialism, specifically for the reason that it has to be able to evolve past Marx and not be sort of akin to a religion.
Boo, boo.
Yeah. But hold on. So
Yeah,
it's because I want to catch him, because it's like I feel like you're confronted with two things here, right? So it's like, if you accept that he's basically saying, I like aspects of Marxism, but then I don't like what it's associated with, then I don't really get what the difference is with capitalism, where it's like, it's like, can't you just say the same thing about capitalism? And then my point is like, J. Cohen's going to say the reason why you need scientific socialism is because you don't want it to be like a religious text where you always go back to the founder, and you don't have like post-Marxism, and you don't have like evolutions since then. And I'm like, I feel like you have to pick one. It's like either you associate to like a system or you associate to like a science. But I think the good thing about the label of science would be that, like it allows it to evolve in some sense. But go ahead, John.
No, I didn't have anything great to say. I've already kind of forgotten it. So,
Like, I guess for me, intellectual inquiry. All right, maybe I'm old-fashioned. All right, but if you're doing philosophy, if you're doing science, it needs to carry to some degree a critical skepticism of its own foundations, right? And so for me to be like, okay, well, Marxism needs to exercise Marx or whatever, which I'm strangely sympathetic to, because I like, my own style is to leave the M lowercase, but it at the same time, having these reference points like is not, as long as you don't sorry, I'm tongue tied here, but I'm saying is like it should not be, if we are holding true to Marx's own values, right? And I think that would maybe Lukács had a points to this effect. But if we're going to be true to Marx's own values, we have to go beyond Marx, right? So like Marxism, as we're understanding it, as like a dogmatic adherence to a basic set of principles, I think is already contradictory in itself. So for me, I guess choosing Marxism over a label like scientific socialism, for me, it's much more problematic to start being like, this is a scientific project like that. Those are the arguments I don't want to get bogged down in whatsoever. I'm very comfortable being like, yeah, Marx is a big deal. We keep his name in it because it's powerful, and it sounds cool, frankly, and he's an important reference point. But like, within him is the means to go beyond him, if that makes sense. And if we're being true to his original spirit and the critical ethos that he had, we're going to criticize him just the same as anybody else. So I guess for me, it's not, we shouldn't have to choose between dogmatism and Marx, I guess, as such.
yeah, I think that's also going to be my position too. I mean, like, you can't really be a Marxist nowadays with all the developments and sort of ideology and theories of ideology, and still maintain like a really naive, reductivist, like false consciousness view of things. You know, it's not anymore just like, oh, we have the right view and you have the wrong view, right? There have been developments such that it's like impossible to go back. And I mean, that's what sort of, dialectics is going to be about. There is like a constant movement with ideas. And Marx was always constantly revising his work too. So there's if you compare his manuscripts to sort of Capital, there's a lot of interesting things that kind of get cut out or get changed or completely redone, or just like he drops them completely. So that's always important to keep in mind as well.
Yeah, and I think so the way I would summarize everything we're saying is like, I think he's, Big D is trying to reject the label science for Marxism, which I'm not even totally sure I'm on board with calling it science, but I think his rejection of it doesn't make sense, because he's basically saying, I don't like the associations in regards to Marx, even though I like a lot of Marx's ideas, or some of his ideas. I feel like, again, like, to get what we're saying that basically science, or like the label of science, would allow you to evolve, so allow you to go into territory that would be, I don't know, different from what the original author like intended. So it allows for like a post-Marxism to grow. I think Althusser has interesting things to say about this, because I don't think he would necessarily, he would see two different visions of Marx, right? He would see like philosophical Marx, and he would see scientific Marx, and he would see like an epistemological break. So he would see like, two different versions of Marx, and it depends. And I think that's actually a really important distinction, because I think Althusser would essentially be saying that those two different versions of Marx basically do different things, because when you label yourself science, it means you're doing a very specific thing. And when you label yourself a philosophy, you're not a science. And that's a very important distinction to have made, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, when Marx describes his work as scientific, right, he's speaking of it in a Hegelian sense. That Hegel thought what he was doing was providing a science through his philosophy, but it doesn't have the same meaning that it does have today. And then my only second point was that I think Althusser, in his late career, dropped the idea of the epistemological break, which is something we have to spread awareness about. So that's my mission in life.
Yeah. I'm just saying, like, I think, I just think that, like, I guess we could cut this out of the edit, but I just think it's interesting because he would see philosophy and science as like being opposed. So he would basically see like two different sort of versions of Marx, and they wouldn't be. That's the whole point of a break. Like, they're not really working in unison.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, anyway, I'll stop now.
Marx, I think, during his lifetime, saw him somewhere between what we would, in our modern conception, call an economist, and someone who could make predictions of large movements in sociology. And I'm afraid about those fronts he fails. Like, his economics, by modern standards, is total. I mean, we evaluate theories like this based on their predictive power, and there just isn't any in this case, right?
It's like I said, it's such a third grader take on what science is, and then predictive power is criticizing Marxism on that front is just also just really weird. I mean, the vast majority of theories aren't going to be selected on predictive power, right? Like, I think so. Like, one quick example of what I'm speaking of happening is I think in the Copernican revolution, once that sort of paradigm shift occurred, it didn't actually at all increase the predictive capabilities of scientific inquiry over and above what the Ptolemaic one did. And so Kuhn has this this quote where he's like, essentially, like Ptolemaic astronomy is still going to be used in engineering today, just because it's like the predictions were just as good as Copernicus's. And so we also have like a variety of criticisms based on like values. So predictive capabilities are a sort of value, but they're going to be like internal towards whatever scientific paradigm you're in. I don't want to go too long on this. So we are only 13 minutes into the video, but so the idea that we have these sort of like values that are removed and like, I don't know, like Platonic ideals that are up there, and they're just going to tell us which scientific theories are good is just kind of also pretty naive, right? It's contingent on what sort of values are produced internally by your theory that's going to sort of shape how you evaluate other competing theories.
I completely agree, but I'm going to try and bite at his bait and actually fight on the terrain of predictive power, because I am appalled, disgusted, and just generally nauseous that people in 2020 are standing behind the predictive powers of neoclassical economics. That is insane. And if you work in this country, anywhere, if you have a job that you go to and you're not the biggest fan of it, and you read, and if you're paying even the slightest attention to the movements of wealth and power in this country for the last few decades or the last century or whatever, and you read Capital Volume 1, if you read his philosophical and economic manuscripts, 1844, and if you do not see yourself and the conditions of your life reflected accurately in them, I will eat my own shoe. Like his prescience in the future of machines, and how machines would come to dominate all production, and how we would become mere bits. We would become the machines of the machines as we just help these massive, unknowable, automated factories produce commodity after commodity. He understood the centralization of money. He understood how like the Gilded Age was going to play out. If you look at his predictions for how capital was going to centralize and grow and accumulate, and if you really track his assumptions, because like you mentioned earlier, Maud, that his like Marx makes points under very specific circumstances. Like he says, these are my assumptions, and as long as these hold, this will happen in a certain way. And so if you go and you look through all of his predictions within Capital, or if you want to call them predictions, but if you look at his theories in Capital, he's usually very explicit. And David Harvey is a really good companion for keeping track of this if you want to go through it with him, of what his basic assumptions for a given statement are. And he says, if these conditions, for instance, if the rate of profit continues to go up and the population of labor stays constant, for instance, this such and such will happen. And he's holding these variables constant. He's moving them in a, I'll even deign to say it like a scientific manner, right? Trying to get at all of these different combinations of the variables that he has identified as being important based on his empirical investigation. And so, is this necessarily the best way of judging a theory? Maybe, maybe not. Is this how we actually adopt theories? No, as Maud pointed out, I subscribe to the sociology of knowledge approach, where these movements are deeper than an individual publishing a good idea and it taking people by storm or whatever. But I think it's insane at this point, especially as someone who I doubt has any kind of like formal training in like economics, to sit here and and rep neoclassical's routine failure to predict what has just the basic going-ons of money and our lives every single day, and their ideologically loaded assumptions built into every single one of their forecasting models, which you're free to go review if you want. Just go ask your econ teacher at the nearest university, like, let's unpack some of the assumptions behind like our favorite forecasting models and see if those actually hold out in real life. And let's look at how they have had a record of predicting how our economy was going to play out. And let's look at, Larry Kudlow on CNN telling us the day before Lehman Brothers goes bankrupt that the economy has never been better. And let's get a grip, all right? Because it's really driving me crazy that we're going to defend this body of knowledge and spit on Marx's poor grave when boy called shots. Like, he knew, like, so much of what he wrote is still so prescient today and feels very predictive, like in my opinion, of how things were going to go, and how things were going to go play out. And I encourage anybody to go back to the text, check that out.
Beautiful. I mean, that would also be my second sort of response if I was trying to defend the predictive powers of Marxism. I mean, we have a variety of predictions that he makes that I think have been empirically proven. I just was reading an article the other day that was looking at the tendency of the rate of profit to fall over what period? I think the 50s to the 70s or something, or maybe it was longer. Maybe it was the 40s to the 70s. And that's like it was providing some empirical justification for this. This, I don't want to say like super important, because different Marxists are going to have different takes on it, but it's a prediction that was made by Marx essentially, and we have justification to believe it. I think we also, obviously, it's very clear that this whole idea of like underconsumption, like Keynesian underconsumption, if we as the government just supply people enough money, then they'll be able to like consume products, right? That's kind of turned out to be pretty bunk with 2008. And so I think Marx's theory of idea of theory of crisis as involving overproduction is also like equally well supported empirically, at least.
Yes, like if you go and ask, like, business cycles as a whole, like upper level class in economics, it's really hard. You learn like a million different explanations for why booms and bust happens, and if any of them are as intuitively gripping to you as Marx's basic insight that this economy is rigged to just maximize production and it doesn't really have any breaks, Like that to me is just, it's intuitively more understanding or easier to understand than the models you're going to get from neoclassical economics.
Yeah, definitely.
So I guess it's almost like if Marx was a I see a super chat here. I'll read it here. My friend Paul Cornelius says, socialism is an ethical system pretending to be an economic theory. Marxism is a metaphysical system pretending to be a theory of history. If Marx was saying, I have a metaphysical religion, okay, I think that'd be more accurate in some ways.
Well, I'm not so sure that the word religion...
Okay, I'm sorry. Like, what a stupid straw man. Like, you're not even bringing up concrete examples. You're just saying, like, you're just making these, like, you're just associating them with, like, labels and using that as, like, a justification for, like, arguing against his ideas. I don't know. It just feels like such a crazy straw man.
Yeah, like what? Does Kant have like a metaphysical religion as well? What about Hegel? Like Quine, like is any metaphysics this sort, a religion of or whatever? I don't know.
Yeah, totally.
And Marx is at least aware of, like, critical of his own, like, metaphysical commitments. Like you can get them laid out to you if you want. You can investigate his own philosophy that is the perspective that he takes on the phenomena that he's explaining, which is something you really cannot do for the ideologically soaked efforts by, again, the neoclassical economics and what we have going through all of our veins today.
But, well, first of all, one thing is the use of the word science was very different in Germany in the 18th and 19th centuries. So basically, for example, Hegel called his philosophy a science when, there was almost, nothing really scientific about it. Science was almost used as a word to describe some kind of rigorous and detailed system.
But this misunderstanding is not just on the side of Marx's critics.
That's true.
Marxists going into the 20th century use Marxism as a science, as a bludgeon, to exclude other ideologies from a discussion when Marxism was on the table. They'd say, your ideologies are ideologies, our views are science. And that has been frequently a bludgeon used against anti-Marxists.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would kind of agree here. This seems pretty representative of, like, even what we're seeing in China or what we saw in the USSR. So he's kind of right, but then he's trying to use it to characterize like all of Marxism proper, and I feel like the majority of at least philosopher or Marxists living in the Western world are going to have lots of issues with the USSR and China and whatnot. So.
And so, like, I'm not even strictly a Marxist, and I don't really agree that it's a science. Well, there's also, the whole debate over whether economics in general is a science. I don't necessarily agree that all of Marx's predictions failed, although I don't really want to go into this because I'd have to read up on this before talking about it a bit more.
I mean, they would, you can always invent, I mean, they don't fail in the way that religious predictions don't fail, right? Like, like like the second coming hasn't happened yet, and everyone always predicts the second coming is going to happen, and it technically that prediction hasn't failed really, but the individual people making these predictions in any kind of sense that we could hold them to account certainly have.
Well, it's definitely true that a revolution in the West did not happen as Marx thought that it would. Although at the same time, most Marxists today, they have sort of, further interpretations of Marxism. They don't necessarily just read the original text and leave it at that, but there's a lot of contemporary Marxist economists who, agree with some of the tenets in Marxism, but, develop them in different ways.
Just another quick thing to note is that Marx, when he was describing his theory of history, was never saying that this was like some sort of like deterministic process that will always occur, right? Talking with someone else a little while ago, and they were reading a book that described Marx as like some sort of historical possibilist. I think that was the term, because yeah, it sounded weird at first, so I was coming at him for that, but then he explained it, and the general idea was that like Marx thinks that there are certain possibilities which can occur, but it's not with like any sort of necessity that they're going to come about. So, and I think that would be sort of an accurate depiction of whenever Marx describes his theories. He's not talking like some sort of determinate like a process, but that it's just we're describing possibilities that can occur. I mean, there's like a necessity in the trend that you have to go through capitalism to socialism, but there isn't like a necessity that's actually going to occur. So
Yeah, no, I see that now. I think oh shoot, what was I going to say? What was he just talking about?
he was talking about how it's like a religious hypothesis that can't really be proven wrong.
Thank you. So, because I just, I think gave a lot of reasons why I think, Marx's predictive power is pretty solid. But, at the same time, I want to go against this characters that, like, Dogma is anti-Marxist. I'm gonna stress that, I think. And so, like, where do we criticize Marx? Well, a lot of people clearly criticize Marx for, like, let's talk about where his predictive power fails. In his model, the more developed, industrialized nations should be the most ripe for revolutionary potential, at least as interpreted by a lot of his followers. And it is exactly in these places, France, Germany, the UK, the US, where revolution has met the saddest and most abject failures and has taken very little in terms of real winnings. And to contrast this, the underdeveloped Soviets managed to, the Russian agricultural country backside or whatever, managed to achieve revolution against their monarchy before and almost the exclusion of everybody else. And so that has been one hot question of what needs to change in the Marxist conceptual framework to account for that kind of thing. And that is where you get a lot of the impetus for the critique of ideology as we know it today, especially coming out of the Frankfurt School, who were seeing a lot of these failures of socialist movements in real time, the defeat to fascism, the defeat to liberalism, et cetera, et cetera. And so you start to see people come up with alternative and, still Marxist in a lot of ways, but distinct philosophical apparatuses to start handling these questions and to criticize Marx and to move past Marx, post-Marxism, et cetera, et cetera. But then you also have pure, at an economic material level, you have phenomena that have probably far escaped how he was originally conceiving things. And I think there has been a lot of good work done on how capital changes in its financial iteration, and what is the difference between industrial capital that dominated the world from the 19th century on to our new contemporary, very recent financial capital that is transnational, completely ethereal, has no concept of borders, and can move instantaneously. All this changes all kinds of things. And so, as a Marxist, if you're going to stay committed to his basic set of problems and not any of his dogmas, you're going to have to continue to confront these things, and you're going to have to keep going back to real experience and empiricism to understand how things are changing, and to keep holding, if you do go back to these texts, keep holding them accountable to things as they develop historically. And that all that is Marxist shit.
Bingo. Except for the Deleuze part. Everything else solid.
I could hop on board with that and say, because you brought up something which is industrial capital versus financial capital that we see more today, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I mean, in some sense, I think you could say that
financialization is really interesting in terms of being almost like in some way predicted by Marx, right? Because you could say that financialization has this like virtualization of money, which could be seen through a lens of like commodity fetishism, which I think would go to the point of like Marx having predicted something that is turning out to be very true to us.
Oh yeah, and I think if you look at the logic of capital that he lays out, like the only reason that I would suspect he doesn't outline this to a T is that you just, it's hard to imagine that it could really get to this kind of freedom. But like what you see today, and especially in financial capital, is just like the embodiment of the pure logic of capital that is almost unconstrained by its, it's anything but itself at this point. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I feel like I'd like to hear your guys' take on this, but it feels like commodity fetishism has like even, I would say, been sort of exacerbated by this like financialization, because like transactions are happening instantly nowadays, Like I remember reading a book about, it was about the 2008 recession, and they were talking about, I think it was, I forget who the author was, but they're talking about how, people will buy stocks and sell them in like milliseconds. And this presents, like, even if you're looking at it strictly through like a really conservative capitalist lens, it presents a real issue because you have absolutely no real sort of like investment in the company's future. You're really just buying stocks and selling them immediately. And so it's like this like really high turnover rate that I feel like is like, I don't know, it's like this hyper version of what we've seen in the past. Like, I forget what the comparison was, but it was something like in the 80s, like people would hold on to stocks for a way longer period of time. And now it's like literally, you're talking about milliseconds that these Wall Street traders are buying and selling stocks.
Yeah, and Mod mentioned his name, so I'll bring it home. If we want to understand Deleuze's concept of deterritorialization, we look at what money is doing right now, and that with the exact process you just described, where it is no longer tied to anything, and it can go anywhere, and it does multiple times in a minute or whatever, and nobody involved is committed, is territorialized to anything, right? Until, except for in the most tangential of ways. And so the like, I think there's an interesting parallel between their concept of deterritorialization and the Marxist concept of abstraction, right? Where you see these, like as you put it, like how is commodity fetishism exacerbated is because it is a symptom of deterritorialization, where the commodity has been divorced from the territory which bore it. And there's no way to recover that through empirical investigation. So it mystifies us, right? And so the same thing is just like an additional layer, an increased intensity of deterritorialization, where our economy loses any kind of geographic reference. You know what I mean? Like, just becomes increasingly, as you put it, a virtual, and literally in this case, with the internet, literally virtual construct that cares not for our oceans or borders or what have you, and has no allegiances, most importantly.
Yeah, I think there's really interesting ways that we can kind of trace out how commodity fetishism is still operating today at like an intensified rate. One time I had a discussion with a data engineer that worked at Facebook. I think there's like interesting parallels there, because this sort of like AI that works is always working like underneath Facebook's algorithms, is kind of structuring relationships in the same exact way that we see money does, or exchange does. So there's like lots of interesting areas you can kind of trace this out, I think, nowadays. So I don't know, that's just my two cents.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that certainly, I think, it's not that I can't find anything useful in Marxism. I think some of its critiques of capitalism are certainly quite useful to me. And I guess, it is sort of, for people on the moderate right, Marxism is kind of a punching bag. And I think it operates sort of in a similar way that, say, something like fascism would operate for people on the left, right?
Yeah.
I mean, like, you'll have a lot of moderate right-wingers denounce Marxism without being able to define it. Just like, to your standard leftist who doesn't understand philosophy, everything's like fascist, right?
Yeah.
What does that even mean, right?
Well, another thing I want to respond to is that claim that Marxism is an ethical theory pretending to be an economic theory.
So the quote from Paul was, "Socialism is an ethical theory pretending to be an economic theory." But
Yeah.
I might say the same thing about Marxism too. I guess, I don't know, but take your pick. There is a sense oftentimes that a lot of the pronouncements that come out of the far left are ethical statements. But since this is the Enlightenment and we're in this weird mode, we can't be honest and say we're making moral arguments, so we have to recontextualize them in a descriptive sense.
Well, I think most people, make both moral and descriptive arguments, and really, almost any theory of economics involves some normative claims about what should be done. That's kind of just inevitable. But at the same time, I mean, if you read, Capital by Marx, it's very clearly a very rigorous economic analysis, and he was very well educated on the the other economists of his time, and it's a very rigorous analysis, and there's not much in the way of ethical judgments in it, although that's obviously always in the background.
Yeah, but I mean, I guess we're sort of teasing the element out of this thing. I mean, people don't read Marx because they're trying to figure out what the valuation of corn is going to be in 2 quarters from now, right? I mean,
yeah.
We do have a study of economics. In fact, the field that I'm trained in, operations research, is very closely connected to that. I do mainly statistical stuff. Like the models we have for economics, like we actually use them to predict things and place valued bets. And then when they fail, we correct them, right? And this is not in the sense that, like, we predict corn to go up and it doesn't go up, and then we're like, oh well, the corn model was talking about something else that was going on in the future. I mean, that's not how this works, right? When we enter into like the real economic theory stuff.
Yeah, but most Marxists today are not making predictions, based on just reading Capital. Just as there are contemporary developments of neoclassical economics, there are also contemporary developments of Marxist economics that do make new predictions and also reevaluate some of the tenets.
I don't know if you should have gave ground there like that. We're just saying, because you just kind of admitted that without defending Marxist theories like proper, that we have to kind of expand upon them, and the reason I bring this up is because it builds into this, Big D's whole narrative that Marxism is bunked in the same way that Freud's psychoanalysis is bunked.
Well, what did he actually say? Because I remember being like, I remember feeling mad that he ceded that ground, but now I can't remember what Big D actually said.
Well, Big D was just talking about how, neoclassical economics, they do like corn modeling predictions, and then when they get stuff wrong, they don't say like, oh, that's because we were tracking something else. It's sort of like they go back and play around with it, and we don't see that with Marxism or whatever.
Also, like, I'm going to insist that the cutting edge of what he's talking about, the people who buy and produce and use and consume these economic forecasts, this is a private industry. This is not like an academic discipline. Like, they're going to get involved to a certain extent, but the people who actually run these forecasting models and who do these businesses where they sell these forecasts to people who want to know them, this is not a scientific enterprise in any meaning of the term. It's a capitalist enterprise for profit, and I feel like that has to absolutely be pointed out. Again, I don't know what an operations manager is. It was really funny to me when he was like, I do some statistics stuff, so I'm basically an economist. That was a lull, but it really reflects how we perceive things, and there's no distance for this man between stats and econ, and that is horrifying. Like that dude just got and the Nobel in econ is meaningless, but dude whose name I cannot remember now, unfortunately, got the big prize for behavioral economics, which is basically just really what would in any other discipline be like overly obvious observations that human beings actually don't always act out of a hyper rationalized sense of economic interest. We have a lot of weird tendencies and are contradictory all the time. And so they like there should be pushback, and hopefully we've given some in our commentary against this idea that modern economics is just chugging along fine, and Marxism is stuck in the past, and it needs to get with it or get the fuck out.
So, what are the? I mean, this is a little off topic, but are the predictions like front and center, or like what are the predictions?
All right, this is also really fucking good point, because earlier in the debate he was saying that Marxism is bunked when it comes in when we analyze it in terms of predictive power or predictive capacity, and now he's saying like what even are the predictions? Does he just like kind of say them, or like what's up? It just kind of shows that he's just like throwing shit out there and seeing what sticks against the wall.
Yeah, what he means by Marx's predictions like have to be limited to some bastardization of the tendency of rate of profit to fall, maybe or just maybe just the basic idea that revolutions will happen, and then you can look around and be like, oh well, they didn't, and so checkmate Marxist.
Yeah,
but yeah, I can't imagine that, because there's just so and again it's because there's things where he actually says, okay, given these variables, this is how this will play off. But then there's also just insights that he has and observations that he makes that like clearly reveal that he's plugged into the forces that are shaping the history that separates him from us. Like his discussion of primitive accumulation, super interesting, and you can just immediately start to see its logic at work all over the place still yet today. And so like it's just such a weird, no other freaking theory, man, gets held to these kind of standards where it's like, I need it as a literal machine that takes an input and gives me out a what to do about it solution. Like it other than, physics, I guess, and the mathematical sciences, but like, I feel like it's only when you raise a politically loaded topic to a certain extent that people break out like the high bar of empiricism against you, and it's pissing me off.
Yeah, so like a common thing that my students will say is that like if we're talking about these sort of like marginalized theories, psychoanalysis and Marxism, right? They're going to ask for proof that it's a real thing. And then what I usually do is ask them for proof that quantum physics, is a real thing. And it kind of catches them off guard because we don't really have any like empirical proof of, the majority of the claims, if not all of them. I'm no quantum physicist, so I won't be making such a, kind of outstanding claims. But just from my readings of philosophy of science, it doesn't seem like we have any empirical, proof yet of these theories. And so like lots of the theorizations that Einstein made, were quickly taken up by science, even though, 5 years ago was like the final proof of the final part of his theory or whatever. My brother could probably explain it really well.
That is a good point, that like we clearly adopt theories on, because I actually am sensitive to this predictive power argument. Like one thing that really like stunned me about like Albert Einstein, for instance, was that he could predict the degree to which light would bend around an object during an eclipse, and that's wild to me. Like that's if we're going to have any kind of like like what made a religious prophet, right, exceptional was their ability to foresee the future, right? That is still somewhat awesome to me. So I'm a little bit sympathetic to it, but at the same time, like as you pointed out, it's so obvious that we have at least other standards that we use, because we have these tools like Einstein's, who, you know, there's clearly something special about them that marks them as a significant breakthrough when they happen. There's this massive change. They spark the discourse in all directions. But it still might be time, like you have to adopt a theory as kind of like a working hypothesis in order to conduct the kind of investigations that are going to allow you to test it. And the attitude that comes off here is that we have basically an a priori means of doing that, of analyzing you know, first of all, reducing a massive body of work and a massive discourse to just a smidge or whatever, and then saying, shoot, God, I keep doing this. I'm so sorry. But anyway, I'm sure I made a point somewhere in there.
Well, like, you guys can correct me if I'm wrong here, but I feel like his point is essentially this one, which is that there's something about neoclassical economics where I can read neoclassical economics, and from that I can start making my own predictions about corn on the stock market, right? So like, if I have a good grasp of this theory, I should be able to use this in real life. And I think John's point really holds here, because I think the whole thing about theoretical physics, it's like, you can just think of something like the Large Hadron Collider, right? So it's like, this is like this really sophisticated, extremely expensive machine that, you know, you're not going to be able to go use yourself and operate yourself. You basically have to put your, I'm going to sound religious here, but you kind of put your faith in scientists, right? Where,
Yeah.
you know, it goes against this like generalized skepticism of like, I need to be able to see things with my own eyes and do things with my own hands, right? It's like, well, I don't even know if you personally believe that, because if you really believe in this like label of science, then at some point you're going to say, you know what, I can't personally vouch for this. I'm just going to trust this like peer-reviewed source that tells me that this is true, even though I personally can't test it, and even though personally I can't even see it. So, yeah.
No, I think that's an excellent point. And if you look at like I always remember, I was a big House fan growing up, the Hugh Laurie show. I remember thinking like, or they made it this kind of like a theme of like, how can you know, give consent in a meaningful way to a procedure you can't begin to understand, right? So there has to be this, you know, House raising the deep philosophical questions, right? But I thought that was pretty interesting, because it really does stick with me of like, as someone who takes science seriously and it's programmed seriously, I think the first thing that you should learn, if you're exposing yourself to the history of science and the way it's evolved, is that you individually know almost nothing with any degree of anything, right? And that knowledge is produced only at great cost, and with a lot of luck, basically. And you're almost certainly stuck taking someone's word for it, right? That is a really good observation.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think we can end it here. We have made pretty much zero progress into this debate, but I thought we did a good job anyway, because it's amazing. Like, there's this kind of meme online that, like, you know, like, right wingers are so wrong that you have to like teach 3 fucking college courses just to get through like one thing they said. And that was exactly what we just experienced. Like, there was just so many claims that were made by Big D that we couldn't make any progress at all. So I guess now I kind of feel bad for Cuck. He did a pretty admirable job given what he had.
Well, to give like I think that like Cuck was actually trying to engage with him philosophically, because like there were definitely a few points there where I would have just like responding to the whole thing of like socialism's an ethical system. Like I would have just been like, "What are you talking about?" You know, like I would have like not even really. And again, I'm being like I feel like I would have just been like way more argumentative about that point than Cuck was, and I think like Cuck is really trying to have like a philosophical discussion. I don't think Big D is on a similar level. I think he's like I don't know. I think they're kind of. I think Cuck did a good job considering the fact that like I don't think this guy is being very charitable. Like what Batina said earlier, like it's kind of crazy to like read something like Capital and just like not identify with even a good chunk of it, right? Like for me, it seems uncharitable from the start, where it's just you're going to read something like this and just you don't have an open mind and you just disagree with it already, and so you're not going to see anything worthwhile.
Yeah, unfortunately, bad faith arguments have abounded in just a little, like, what, 16 minutes that we watched. So
Yeah, if I had a takeaway thesis from this, it's that the argument that we're dealing with here is fundamentally in bad faith. And what's more interesting to demonstrate than like why it's factually wrong is that the philosophical commitments that it leads you into holding are contradictory and don't really make any sense when you spell them all out, because the only thing that they really have in common is being anti-Marxist, right? And this because anti-Marxism has been taken as a non-consciously probably dogmatic given, and it's not going it's not going anywhere, and that makes it pretty much impossible to argue meaningfully with. But like I think hopefully we've shown those inconsistencies in his own argument. I was hoping, we haven't gotten too far into it. Maybe we'll finish it sometime. But I was hoping he would explain that part about how is he rejecting Enlightenment values, and at the same time valorizing science, or even caring about what is or what is not. Like, what does that mean? How do I square those two circles, I guess?
yeah, he's gonna go into postmodernism, and he kind of covers his anti-enlightenment later. So hopefully we can pick it up another time and analyze that, because I think the postmodernism is also where things get pretty interesting. So
I mean, what I would propose is maybe like if we want to do a second episode, maybe it would be better to just like we all listen to the podcast individually, and then we just like maybe take notes here and there, and then we could just kind of like talk about points we thought were interesting about the debate, rather than going like minute by minute like this, where it's gonna take us like 10 episodes to get through like this whole thing.
yeah, I was already thinking of ways that we could improve this. But anyway, I'm gonna end it now. So thanks for listening.